a work in progress. Been working on it for a couple of years. The title is tentative at this point. I played around with the various titles. I think as background, the only thing I would probably say is that I do make assumptions. I would describe myself as a humanist. I think humanity potentially is worth conserving. I think all humans potentially have a unique contribution that they could make to the world, to our society. I do look at the concept of human as being multiple. It's not only biological, it's not only social, it's also intellectual, and there's even a mechanical aspect that we could talk about if we wish. My intent is to create some kind of introduction to cybernetics for the lay public. This is my version, it can't be anything else. To promote it as enacted in conversation. And that's probably what might be a little new. I look at cybernetics as involving two domains, domain of relations and domain of dynamics. And the domain of dynamics that is of particular interest, and that's what gets enacted, I say, in conversation. I want to promote conversation as an avenue to participation and to the devolution of power. It's an alternative response to conflict, an alternative to violence. And then to encourage participation in everyday life, that everyone potentially, again, can participate. This idea of conversation becomes key in seeing that happen. Then I try to offer a few thoughts on how to, on doing the above. Sort of just a set of things that I've happened to think about and find useful. For me, it's important to talk about what the book is not, because I get lots of suggestions, and those suggestions are useful, certainly, but sometimes I have to explain that's not what this is about. I do not look at this book as a marketing tool, although I do hope that maybe it proves hopeful, offers some hope for some people who might read it. It's not a how-to manual, but it does offer some ideas for participation. It's not going to be mathematical, not mathematical exposition, although it does deal with abstraction as necessary and desirable. I think often abstraction is looked at as something to avoid in the book for the lay public, and that's an idea I'd like to find a way to debunk. Does not make any claim of authority, although it does have a basis in a particular legacy of cybernetics. And it's not intended to be a final or fixed set of concepts, although I'm trying to write it such that it exhibits at least a little temporary stability. So, what I hope it does is to raise the ante on thinking and language, its partner. I talk about cybernetics as a way of thinking about ways of thinking, but add that it is one of those. So it circles back and re-enters itself. This way of thinking about ways of thinking is not a meta way of thinking. It circles back on itself. To offer a vocabulary for talking and thinking about the dynamics of relations, to identify language traps for which cybernetic perspectives might be helpful. And what I hope it does is to serve as a kind of a guide for some ideas for contributing to a desirable society through our everyday action. The last two slides or an attempt, as a segue into Jamie's spreadsheet. These are 6 items that I've identified that I'd like to get from cybernetics. And I think cybernetics in its current form is uniquely situated to help do this. First, to bridge 2 cultures, art and science. I do not regard cybernetics as a science. It uses science, it informs science, and it is both art and science and craft. In the long run, not currently possible, but in the long run, I'd like to see it eliminate academic disciplines as we know them. I consider cybernetics to be anti-disciplinary. I like to see it from it to develop a consciousness of presence. That's my term, as opposed to the consciousness of purpose that particularly Gregory Bateson really warned us about. It's a complicated matter, and but one that I think needs to be addressed if we want to address the future of humanity. Then to create a craftsmanship in and with time. So time becomes not something external, not something that's given, not something that's equivalent to the clock, but something that can be manipulated to our benefit. To move from a participatory, to move towards, I like to see cybernetics help move toward a participatory design and a participative dialogic society. I do make a strong connection between cybernetics and design. And then last, I think cybernetics might be able to help us remove the assumption, widely held, that it is human nature to be greedy, lazy, boastful, cruel, all the 7 sins. I think this is an assumption, not a fact. And I think it is reinforced by the systems that we live in that require that human nature be this way for those systems to continue to persist and prosper. And last, what can I do? Where is my role in all this? I am interested in worldwide conversations on how to think about a change of system, new systems, not simply a change in current systems, not simply improvement on current systems. Just to bring me a brief comment here. One of my mentors, Herbert Brun, would talk about systems that use the word perfect. They become perfect, they can't be improved any further. We look at them and say, we don't want them. This is not desirable. It's at that point, when systems become perfect, that the opportunity for a change of system opens itself to that possibility. I maybe also add here that these conversations we're having online are useful, helpful. I enjoy them. But I think to emphasize that our conversations here are limited relative to our face-to-face conversations when we have those. The channel capacity of our medium just doesn't capture the complete dynamics that happen when you're face-to-face. So how to create worldwide conversations that are face-to-face, perhaps augmented by these virtual or online interactions, I think is a challenge for technology. Second, I would participate in creating a new form of school. And this new form of school would be something that I would like to see be used as a model for a new society. I won't go into much more detail about that here, I know Lowell has talked about Warfield's idea of school, which I find very intriguing. Uh, uh, I spent my entire career, good part of my life, most of my life, working in education, mostly as an administrator. And while I've enjoyed that time very much, I see huge issues with how we go about doing the enterprise of education. And finally, of course, I want to complete the book at some point. So those are my thoughts, and perhaps open it up for discussion.
So Larry, are you considering to bring this into an existing school, like some kind of an experimental K-12 school or college, as providing them as a course? Or are you thinking towards the direction of a completely different school that has to be built from ground?
I'm thinking of something completely different.
Totally different.
Yeah, it is a question of feasibility in what's possible. What I have in mind is not something in any kind of large scale is currently possible. It's something that I see as perhaps starting from something very small, and this working its way into something much larger.
I used to have a boss, his name is John Sperling. He saw the problem of the old education system, so he quitted his professorship and came out to build up a new school. He started from a rented classroom with a small blackboard and 8 students only. And as he kept going and going, the enterprise becomes the largest education enterprise on Wall Street. It's the story of Apollo Group. So starting from a very small is very possible. So what is your roadmap of going there? I mean, how can we help you to?
That's a good question. I think what I need is just a few people who have a serious interest in doing it without pay, who could just sort of start and begin to identify possible clients or students, if you will. I think part of the feasibility issue is that it should not cost students anything. It should be something that is available, and to do that without government help is, of course, a challenge. And that's why it's currently, I put it in the category of not yet possible, but something we need to think about. But as a starting point, I would need just a few people who really want to spend a little bit of time doing it and just trying to find a way to get started, find some common ground and a way to get started.
Actually, you can start it right now if we could find a group of young kids for you, right?
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
So
I'm not sure that I would like to participate in it. Because I don't think, it sounds a bit like a romantic dream to me. So going back to Homo Universalis, abolish the disciplines, how can that be academic? Is that not something which was very much in the 19th century?
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by academic.
How can that be research? How can it be a university? we need the disciplines to be able to communicate with each other, high quality specialist knowledge. Or do you
Sure.
want to abolish all that?
No, no. Currently, currently it does that. I'm imagining a project-oriented school where students call on the knowledge that they need to do their projects. If they're involved in doing a piece of research and want to do some science, they call on that. But they could also call on someone in the arts community. They have an idea for that project. So, yeah, it's. I'm not for suddenly, abolishing all academic structures or universities.
You said it, eliminate
Like my
academic
career on.
disciplines. You said it. You read literally, you said eliminate the academic disciplines.
Yes, but not so.
That's a little bit extreme. That's what I thought as well. But it's Larry's personal take. I mean, no problem. We
Yeah,
should
he's
tolerate
fine with
that.
Just a minute. It's something I want or desire. It's not something that I see as currently possible. I can imagine a world in which we have educational institutions that do
Yeah,
not
I
have.
can imagine many worlds. And I had a question also. Is this inspired by Habermas' idea of herrschaftsvrije communication van alle met allen? So, unrestricted discourse without power structures? Is that
Yes.
in the background?
I missed the first part of it.
Is this Habermas?
Oh.
Jürgen Habermas?
No, I haven't drawn from him.
Larry, perhaps are you referring to the need to break down barriers between disciplines, avoid the distinctions between disciplines in an illuminating ways? And that's a possibility.
Yeah, it's not that there aren't still sort of these. I look at disciplines as being logical types in a way, and that's what makes them difficult to talk across them. And those logical types will continue to be there as long as we use the logic that we do, which is the logic we have, and so it'll continue to be used. So we have the biological domain, we have the social domain, and so forth, and those will continue to be domains. My problem is that those disciplines, as they currently are, because they represent logical types, create structures that are hierarchical and in which get embedded with rewards and with power structures.
Larry, while you're there, I mean, I like your presentation very much. I look forward to reading your book. You mentioned amongst your mentors, Gordon Pask. I'd be fascinated to know a little bit about, how and where and when you met Pask, and how do you see his influence on your thinking?
Oh, yeah, I regard him as one of my mentors also. I worked with him for 3 8-week sessions when I invited him to Old Dominion University, where I was working at the time. And we would spend almost every evening over dinner, a few hours every evening during the week, just talking. And I found that much of what I now think, what I write, is influenced by those talks more than they are by what he wrote. And I guess that's in part because I took from it, what was useful to me at the time, and continues to be. My interests and his are not the same in how we might use conversation theory, for example. But the idea of conversation, his idea of conversation, is very useful to me. In fact, it's overwhelmingly useful.
Thank you very much. I just to echo that, many people who are Paskians became passionate about Pask's work because of personal contact with him in conversation. I mean, he was charismatic, to say the least, and so his books and his writings are challenging to have met him in person was, I think, a real privilege. Thank you.
If I could just elaborate on what Larry was saying. Bernard Scott sent out some important works by Heinz von Forster on the cybernetics of cybernetics. Heinz had this one sentence that really stood out when I reread his work. He says, if the hypothesis of an environment, if there is a hypothesis of an environment, it must possess structure. And that implies a radically different notion of learning from disciplines. Disciplines are the results of learning from the environment, learning our interaction, etc. But the learning process itself means the exploration more of like a Dewey experiential interactive, because there's an interesting irony in language. We call the disciplines subjects, but these subjects have been turned into an object, and we then teach objects. But the learning process is a subjective interaction of the inner organization, as second order cybernetics says, and the outside environment. So just rethinking, if the hypothesis of that there is an environment, it must involve structure. So how do you explore the structure of the environment, number one? Number two is, how do you structure the environment of learning, or the environment of your institutions in a political sense, so that there can be self-organization, so that there can be intelligence, evolutionary intelligence that grasps a larger aspect than what is in a discipline or, quote, subject?
My version of second order cybernetics involves two domains: the domain of relations, the domain of dynamics. When I use the word structure, I'm talking within the domain of relations. These are non-intersecting domains. I did get this from Matron. Domain of relations is a domain of explanations, therefore the domain of science. Domain of dynamics, the domain of experience, again from Maturana. It's this dialectic, the two together, that needs our attention. If for those that are familiar with Ross Ashby's An Introduction to Cybernetics, particularly the very first part of it, he introduces the book with the very first concept, almost the very first concept, is a change of state. He creates these things called transformations, and then he draws a kinematic diagram as states move from state to state. That's an attempt at drawing a dynamics kinematic diagram. In order to do that, he had to make an assumption about time. So in the diagram, a change of state occurs in accordance with some clock that someone, an observer, has identified. This clock is external and it's fixed.
That's called, or not?
This is an very elegant way then of trying to be able to move from dynamics to what he uses as the diagram of immediate effects, the cause and effect, the relational. I think when we move into the social, actually into the biological, but into the social, and that we no longer can assume this external clock. We cannot assume that the clock is fixed. We have to take time as something that we manipulate in order to help us get what we want. There's, of course, a lot been written about this. Some of the emails have to do with Lumen. Bernard talked about Gordon Pask's paper that he talks about time and so forth. And I'm not addressing, Lowell, your question directly, I know, but I'm trying to get at that it's not just structure. In fact, the emphasis maybe ought to be more on process, allowing the structures to be more temporary, not to be quite so stable, not to be quite so fixed. Let's allow continual transformation of structure.
What's fascinating in reading the Republic of Letters of the founders and the thinkers across the Atlantic in the 1700s was the introduction of time and development into the concept of the politic. Instead of the crystalline structure of absolute knowledge, it was truly the natural philosophy and natural science concept of time and evolution. So you would get someone like Boyle that would do an experiment of putting a mouse in sort of a sealed container. Ultimately, the mouse would die. He puts a plant in there and he watches over time and sees the interaction. And then he's able to postulate something in the invisible domain of this thing called oxygen or whatever they were trying to get to, carbon dioxide. And so that idea of time, I think, is core, as you say, is not external, but is internal as a developing structure.
I would call that a clock and not yet time.
A clock, not time. Very good. If I could just change the subject a little bit, when you first started, Larry, you talked about cybernetics being uniquely situated to bridge both art, science, and then something I just learned, craft. And that really brings the practical aspects to the fore. It's not just arts and science, it is a tool set. I think that's a very well stated basis or pillar of what we're trying to do.
You know, the ancient Greeks had 4 notions of time. I don't know them, but one of them is linear time and you had circular time. So there were 4 notions of that. I think it's worth to take a look at that.
Good. I know one of the concepts of the Greeks was chronos, which was methodical time, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. You know,
Yeah.
There's that type of thing, but the developmental time that's inherent in emergence. Now that would be interesting to go back to.
Now, there is some literature, and I couldn't recall who started it, but or who is the key figure in it. But to set up time as actually a mystery, as something that's invisible, imperceivable. And then the next step is to say what metaphors are we using. So to just go straight ahead to the metaphors. And then next, around the metaphors, one can notice paradigms and stories and narratives that reinforce a certain type of time. So the story goes that time first was perceived as circular, this circadian time, I guess they call it. And then there is this person, and I don't remember his name. He wrote the popular book how a certain tribe who was traveling in the desert of North Africa invented the idea of time as an arrow. And then they kind of introduced this idea of a purpose and an end of time. And so that idea then took over. And then William James or Augustinus say, okay, there is linear time, but there's also time as we experience it. We're always in the present.
Yeah.
And there is a past and a future. And then William James had the saddleback experience of time. So Larry, have you explored the time from the perspective of metaphors, or how have you?
May I comment before Larry comes in on this one? Benjamin Lee Whorf, the anthropologist, describes how various North American communities have very different concepts of time from we in the West. Now, Pascal, in a sense, draws on that kind of thinking, as many people do. They make a distinction between the kind of universal time that we set with our calendars and our clocks. These are the agreements we make. And based on that kind of concept of time, the structure and the linearity, we construct our natural sciences. Pascal begins with his, he called it neoclassical science, that's classical science with that kind of concept of a linear time. With neoclassical science, as presented in his conversation theory, it begins with the idea of everyone living in their own subjective time, as observers, as human beings, and coming together and in selected occasions to agree that they're in the same place at the same time. It gives a whole other view of how we construct our shared knowledge, our shared world. So we've come together at the moment. We're agreeing somewhere that we're in the same at the same time and place. But who knows what we get up to when we're not here.
Yeah, this is Jerry. I just entered the conversation and would make one remark, and that is the notion of time as manifested in physical symbolism is radically different from the notion of time as it is used and empirically developed in the sciences of the chemistries and biology. These are very different conceptualizations of time and how time is created and how it moves.
Do you want to elaborate?
Larry?
Well,
sorry, Jerry.
Yeah, it's very simple, really. The question of time as change is what is expressed in the chemical notion of the law of mass action, or in terms of genetic symbolism of genes, is that of change of the form. And so the whole question of identity enters in with the change of form and the temporal relationships among forms that are informed by the identity of the object or the individual. So every human being runs on their own internal clock. The agreement to have a public agreement that there'll be a standard clock which everyone will use when they're dealing with others is the social issue. And a social issue that agrees with the physical notions.
I think I can relate to what Jerry says in that we have an experience, a subjective experience to velocity. And velocity is mass that is moving through space over time. And then I don't remember who was the first one to say, okay, this is a body. So we're all bodies with relatively moving to each other. And then someone said, okay, let's separate mass from space from time. And those one could argue are artifacts. And so if I understand Jerry, he's talking, because in chemistry, indeed, it's all about gradients and differentials that kind of determine whether a gene is turned on or off. And it's not about this, or at least that's the way I work with this idea. And it's not about some arrow that started at minus infinity, and then there was a burst of ones and zeros, and then they just kept on colliding, and then poof, we're here today.
It's a question of which symbol system you use to describe the notion of change. And this description, the mathematical description of it, depends on which symbol system you select to use to do the mathematics. So to put it in terms of differential equations is an arbitrary decision. And yes, It can be objective. The human individual, in their own experience of time, you can call it subjective, or you can just call it the notion that they're emerging or evolving. But there are different metrics associated with these notions of change.
I would like
This is
to
very-
raise a question, but I think we should go back to Larry.
Yes.
Go ahead,
We should go back to the presentation.
please do.
Okay. But this is the first time Jerry Chandler joined us. So first
Second
we should
time.
say second time.
Yeah.
I
He
mean-
was there while you
Oh.
were traveling.
Oh, okay. Then when he was here during my absence. Okay, anyway, so welcome. But let me add one question, perhaps relevant. Jerry just reminds us the fundamental biological clock that every one of us carry in our body, and which is rooted in chemistry, and perhaps at an atomic level. And we human evolving from apes, we borrowed the first concept of time from the rotating of the Earth towards surrounding the sun. So it's kind of a two different level of time perception. And which one is more fundamental? Obviously, I think our biological one is more fundamental. So it is an interesting topic. Maybe we can another session, Jerry, on this.
I would say that all of these are ways of explaining. I take it that time is a human invention. It's not something that exists out there. It's something we created in order to help us explain certain things. It's something that was necessary in the languages that we that have evolved. And this includes in physics. This is a human invention.
Yeah,
And,
but
useful.
is there a limitation of such invention? For example, the fact that we are all going to die.
Yeah.
Or we have to invent our death, right?
Well, yes, of course. And that's where cybernetics turns back on itself. In
I think
cybernetics,
the
in
clocks
cybernetics,
are not
human
an
fate-
invention.
in cybernetics, human fate or fate in general is that all things decay. And that what humans add is a retardation of that decay. But ultimately, everything decays. That's what cybernetics, I say, says. And but that doesn't mean we don't work to retard. There wouldn't be any life. I mean, we wouldn't have anything to do if we didn't have to work on retarding the decay. And so that's why we do what we do, I think. I guess what I'm trying to point out is that yes, there's many of these different versions and so forth of time, but we still use the same word. It's important that we have some synchronicity with respect to our clocks that we use so that we can be at the same place at the same time when we want to. It's important in physics that they have a particular concept of time because it creates knowledge or it creates something that's useful. It's been very useful to us. But when we take it as absolute, as given, as ultimately the case, as eternal, then we have a problem. And history has shown that over and over, that ideas that at one time were held as absolute, at some point get turned over. And I think it's important to be aware of that as we move ahead. And it also, I think Jason last week talked about the need to be humble in a sense. And this is humbling that we can't come up with the absolute truth of the world. We just work at what we do the best we can, and hopefully our intentions are good.
Larry, could you just elaborate a little on your antipathy towards purpose and the concept you have of presence? Because indeed, purpose organizes the world around you and creates major blind spots. So I'd like to see how you juggle that purpose, presence, and how you see them as an antipathy.
My problem is that the word purpose has become used in everyday language and quite widely in a particular way. It's particularly used to talk about setting goals and then, identifying the means to achieve those goals. Where goals are targets, treated as points in the future, and then and that's purposeful behavior. You're shooting toward a goal or something. If you go back to the original, for me, it's the original paper on cybernetics, Rosenbluth, Wiener, and Bigelow, where they talk about purpose. They identify that any system can appear to be purposeful because it operates within certain limits, and that becomes its purpose. It's the goal-oriented purpose, which is fine. It's a goal-oriented kind of purpose that I challenge. So the question is, in my education, after my engineering education, was in management and decision making. And one of the things that I've been working on is alternatives to goals and objectives as a way of expressing and talking about desires. And in particular, the way that I'm trying to advance, I guess, is desires as constraints, as a set of constraints. And then intention, rather than being purposeful in the sense of seeking a goal, intention is just awareness of your desires as a set of constraints. This is very different than the idea of trying to plan A to B to C in some purposeful way. So that's the problem I have with the word purpose.
I really like the way you're using the word constraints. Jamie uses the word container. Heinz von Forster uses the word envelope. Alicia Guerrero uses the aspect of enabling constraints and disabling constraints. Yeah. And I really think that is a subject matter of cybernetics. You talk, Larry, about the uniquely situated cybernetics as a bridge between art, sciences, crafts. Part of that bridge, I think, has a major structure of understanding how constraints enable, disable, form, and deform that allow us to say, how do we educate? How do we structure our public commons in terms of what is the nature of the constraints and environment that we design, and language, if you're using a Pasquian approach. So that idea of constraints, envelope, boundaries, that's really a subject matter that no discipline directly addresses, though is inherent in all disciplines.
Yep.
Actually, if I would say, I think that is precisely what George Spencer Brown is doing with his distinctions.
Yeah.
Because each time a distinction is made,
yeah.
a boundary is presented. And
yes. Jamie, may I return to Larry and his concept of presence? I mean, it rang several bells with me. One, of course, was with the phenomenologists, such as Heidegger and so on, who talk about presence. But also it reminded me of a brief comment from Heinz von Förster, where he says, to know is to be. And he's just in that short phrase, he's reminding us that we are beings. And whether it's meditation or just sitting quietly or just paying attention to the world around you, like listening to the natural life around you, there are ways of being that many of us in our busy lives, with our heads full of thoughts and plans and ideas and purposes and whatever, fail to get to grips with. It took me a long, long time to come to the understanding that most females I met had a far more empathetic sense of what was happening in a social setting than I had. I had to train myself as a psychologist to just sit and become aware of what was happening around me. And one can then, feel others' feelings in a sense. You relate to them more closely and effectively. So that was my the idea of presence being brought into the discourse of what is normally this rational science.
Maturana said, all knowing is doing and all doing is knowing.
Yes.
Could I impose a question here on the meaning of the term desire in this context? What synonyms are you thinking of, and what antonyms are you thinking of?
I start by distinguishing desire from need. A need is something that recurs over and over. In other words, I satisfy the need, then it comes back again, and I have to satisfy it again. So hunger, sleep, so forth. Desire, I use the word desire when I want to talk about that which I want. It's lacking, and it's not currently the case. But once satisfied, then I can move on to something else.
So sexual desire in this context?
Conceptual?
No, sexual desire, is it a need or is it a
Well,
desire?
there's some ambiguity. There's some ambiguity between these. I think there are certainly aspects that I would, regard as a need. But then we superimpose other desires onto it. So it becomes a mixed bag.
I quote the Rolling Stones. You don't always get what you want, but sometimes you might find you get what you need.
It's
Be
a major
careful.
step
Be
of
careful what you wish
Great
for.
source of wisdom.
And there is also Lacan who has his jouissance. Is that, Larry, are you familiar or connecting with that? I'm still in the process of trying to understand jouissance. The desire in the context of psychoanalysis.
the major step which Freud made in the early 30s is to abolish the biological concept.
Edmondo, do you, Larry, I have another question for you. In the very beginning, you said that you were interested in facilitating human conversation. Did I understand that correctly? So you wanted the quality of, if the ethos of your book was to highlight the importance of conversation, just to improve the quality of life of all humans on Earth, so to say. If I don't know whether I capture it. So you think that there is value, just in terms of quality of life, or the greatest happiness. I mean, there are many different ways of saying it, but that the emphasis was on the human, that you wanted the humans to benefit. And so then my question is, what sort of conception are you, or do you have like a chapter that really focuses on the conception of what it means to be human, and the different traditions and how they fit into cybernetic thinking? Just what it means to be a human being as opposed to an animal or a machine, or a computer, a robot,
I think we have to be careful when we talk about happiness, or it sort of brings images currently, at least to many people, of a utopia of some type. I think we have to remember that utopia is a concept of something you can never achieve.
I
So I
agree.
mean,
Yeah.
you move, but then you move and then something else happens, then you switch gears and you're constantly moving and changing, but utopia is not something that can be achieved. And so we don't want to talk as though it can be.
Yeah.
But yet we have utopian intentions. So, you know, I mean, in the sense of, you know, trying to create a more desirable world to live in.
So in agreement with
in order to retard the decay.
Sorry. In agreement
So-
with Larry points out that we don't have to be driven by the biology. We can construct our worlds to be positive places. With respect to the particular topic of talking about things like happiness and so on, or quoting Freud, so I'm surprised as a Paparian you get caught up in that kind of swamp, but that's my view. A very good source is William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. And it will lead you to realize a whole variety of subjective experiences like joy in the Holy Spirit or nirvana or bliss, things which are ineffable because they're experienced personally. So it's, I think that my view is that as humans, the human condition is open-ended. We are still creating what it is to be human.
Yes, but I would like to get back, Larry. You kind of hung on the word of happiness, but you never told me the sort of thinking you put into it. What does it mean to be human as opposed to an animal, a machine, a bacteria? Like, what is the difference? And is that question even worth asking, or are you just saying I'm not interested in touching the subject of what does it mean to be human? Because maybe that may help us understand what the conversation stands for and how it can bring hope. Maybe, yeah, the word happiness is just some whatever, some popular word, but maybe hope. And just as a quick footnote, I heard Bernard say Popperian, and maybe was wrong, and a swamp. And so I think if we pursue the line of the greatest happiness, then it actually gets to freedom or free time that people can decide for themselves how to have a fulfilling life. So there is no swamp. I think there is a way out of the swamp.
I was specifically referring to psychoanalysis.
That is not a swamp either. There is a way out of it also. And it gets
May
back to...
Jamie, may
Yeah.
I? Here, Habermas is very important because for Habermas it is a counterfactual, the happiness and the understanding between human beings. That's a counterfactual which we have to entertain in order to keep the society humane.
Okay.
But it is not the
Yes.
case.
Yeah.
I think there is a question that you raised, Jamie, I think. And that is, as we think about the world, as we think about humanity, how do we think about what is in all of our interests? And as a humanist, that's the direction I go, is what is in all of our interests. And the best starting point that I've discovered so far is that I think most people, if they were asked their preference, would prefer a world without violence. Now, I've come across people who that's not the case. They've grown up in a culture of violence. It's something that it's a part of their life. It's the way they live. And maybe we, you know, in this, in some world, we have a place where they can all go and practice whatever they want. But for the most part, I think people would prefer to live in a world without violence. And that's the constraint. So that's where I start as the overriding constraint, the overriding desire for how we proceed. Let's see what would it take to eliminate violence from the world.
Okay.
This is far too far, because only in the 1930s and 1940s we have seen cohorts of people wanting violence.
Yeah,
Let me say something. As a timekeeper, we have run out half of our time for Larry. So, Jamie, you're raising a huge question that I think all of us need to think, take more time. And I think from a different, completely non-scientific point of view, from a point of view of religions, I would say it serves you guys right because you abandoned God and God had all those answers, but you abandoned God. So you have to figure them out by yourselves. But let's do it next time.